In the book, you also critique CPUSA for its inability to like fully grasp with the realities of settler colonialism, and that creating this vacuum along with state repression for the new left to come in, but the new left sort of had some eclecticism, so to speak.
Mhm.
Um, why do you think the old left, so to speak, was really unable to grasp with settler colonialism, class collaboration? Um, and why was the new left eclectic about those matters, so to speak?
Well, with regard to the former, uh, unraveling the United States is not easy because, number one, not only were there so many poor Europeans who crossed the Atlantic and did well, which creates a basis for opportunism, a basis for overlooking, believe it or not, genocide against Native Americans, for example. In my Texas book, I tell a story of how the Cherokees, who once controlled the southeast quadrant of North America, the state of Georgia and North Carolina, for example, that they sought to assimilate, including Christianity, including sedentary agriculture, including enslaving Africans. But they still had to go, oftentimes swept out of their mansions, and with Europeans, poor Europeans, oftentimes moving into their mansions, just sweeping the floor and taking over. And then, of course, after the US Civil War, you have the construction of these land grant universities that are still with us, particularly in the Midwest, where the sons and daughters of settlers were able to get education. The sons and daughters of settlers were the professors and the administrative staff. My ancestors were not allowed. And I think that those sorts of emoluments create a material basis for a certain kind of opportunism, for example. And then there's the further problem, which I mentioned in another interview the other day, which is that we depend upon various comrades and various nations to give their analysis of the history of their country. So therefore, understandably, we depend upon the Cubans to give us an analysis of the Cuban Revolution, the importance of 1959, et cetera. And I think that many in the international community were dependent upon US analyses for analyses of the United States of America. But the problem was that the analyses of the United States of America, in my opinion, were not altogether penetrating. And so it reminds me of Vice President Dick Cheney during the Iraq War when he was vice president. So he would feed misinformation to journalists. So, for example, Judith Miller of the New York Times about Iraq's capabilities. And then he'd go on the Sunday talk shows and say, well, as the New York Times said, and then he's basically quoting misinformation that he fed to a journalist. And so it's been difficult because many of the revolutionary forces, they depend upon the US analysis and then their respective revolutionaries. And then people in the United States say, oh, okay, revolutionaries abroad are echoing our line, so there must be something to it. But one does not have to be a historian to question basic fundamentals. For example, in 1776, there were thousands of enslaved Africans, mostly alongst the eastern seaboard of North America. By 1861, there were millions, and it becomes difficult to mount this hypothesis, this thesis that 1776 was the seedbed of abolitionism, because if the number of enslaved Africans goes from the thousands to the millions, and you call that abolitionism, I'd hate to see what a pro-slavery project would look like. Likewise, in 1776, as noted, the settlers occupying the eastern seaboard by 1861 had moved all the way to the Pacific, uprooting the Mexican population, not to mention countless Native American nations poised to cross the Pacific, which will be the subject of a future book of mine, and seized Hawaii, an independent kingdom for example, the 50th and presumed final state. And so the United States is not an easy puzzle to solve. So I'm sympathetic to those who are not able to solve it. And then the same hobgoblins that hobbled what you call the old left were similarly afflicting the new left. That is to say, the legacy of misinterpretation of the history, which then involves the inability or difficulty in grappling with right opportunism and left sectarianism, with the new left oftentimes ensnared by the latter more than the former, and some of the communist comrades more ensnared by right opportunism than left opportunism or left sectarianism. So I'm sure some of your listeners may say, who is this guy? You know, he's making all these pronouncements, which is a fair assertion. But all I ask is that you look at the evidence, quite frankly, and that you ask yourself the fundamental question, which is, after all we know about 2016 to 2021, culminating on January 6, 2021, with an armed insurrection, and the fact that the Tangerine Tyrant is able to return to office in January 2025, 75 million votes accumulated, I mean, the international community demands answers. So you can quibble with Gerald Horne, fair enough, but provide some answers as to how we have found ourselves in this pickle. Please give me some answers. I'm willing to yield if I hear better answers.